different. Instead of it being a 5-chapter unit, we're going to do it as an era. And this particular era encompasses, as you've noticed by your outlines, more than 5 chapters. So we're going to begin with kind of where we picked up at the end of the Gilded Age in the 1890s. And we'll go through the Progressive Era, World War I, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and then ultimately end with the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany in 1932. So, questions on that? All right, so first let's look at what happens from 1890 to 1970. There's a lot of overlap that occurs here in this idea of the progressive movement. During the Industrial Revolution, which America is now in full force in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, post-Civil War era, it creates different classes of people because of so much wealth being created. You obviously have your elites, your J.P. Morgans, your Rockefellers, your Carnegies, your Vanderbilts, your wealthy, super wealthy elites. But also you see a middle class beginning to emerge. This is your people that are like middle managers, supervisors, professionals, skilled workers, not your average everyday laborers, okay? Not your lower class laborers. These professional type people, these middle class people, have a little money in their pocket and they send their kids to school. And ultimately, they even send their kids to college. So this industrial era creates a whole generation of young Americans that are educated, that are well-read. Some of them even travel to other countries. Now, if you were traveling from one country to another before the Industrial Revolution, that is a perilous journey. You may not even survive. But now, after the Industrial Age has been ingrained into society, it's safe. Many people cross the ocean for fun. You ever heard of a boat called the Titanic? You ever see the movie? Did those wealthy people look like they were really roughing it? No, it's like a hotel, a floating hotel. That was in the 19 teens. That's in this era, okay? So imagine 50 years earlier you're crossing. No steam power. All right, so it takes 6 weeks instead of a couple weeks or even a week. So, and it was perilous. It was dangerous. Now people are crossing the ocean for fun. Many people, like, hey, let's go on vacation to Europe. Go stay for a month and come home. People did that. People that had money, all right? And that's who we're talking about here, the middle class people and the wealthy elites. So, this group of people that emerge out of this are called progressives. Progressives. So who are the progressives? Progressives are a younger generation in the 1890s, and they are the first generation of the modern age. They're the first generation to live in an entirely industrialized and urbanized nation. Many of these progressive people were highly educated or had some kind of professional training. They were globally aware because many of them had traveled to other countries as part of their education. So they had a global perspective. And being that they are good Americans, they believed that America should play a large role in that global society. They believed in efficiency and progress, obviously. They believed that humans are capable of achieving great things and that they could improve themselves. Humans have that ability. As a result of these new beliefs, their ideas on the role of government begins to change. These are the first people that wanted to use government as a tool of reform to encourage that change for people, efficiency, progress, human reforms, and use the government to do that. Previously, when we talk about government getting involved, we're doing things like tariffs or compromising or trying to restore the union or dealing with foreign affairs, regulating currency. Government really hasn't been involved in societal things. The progressives changed the narrative. They want to see government involved in society, to try to improve people's lives. So, in order to do this, experts are needed at the highest level of the federal government to do this. So, they believe that they are the people for the job. They are the people for the job. So, what are they going to reform? Well, in short, everything completely changes at this turn of the century with progressives. They were very much American activists. If you're an activist about anything, what are you? What defines you? If I were to say you're an activist about something, what does that mean about you? You are very motivated to bring about a change. Very good, Cooper. So the things that they want to try to use, start using government as a tool of reform. They tried to fix things in society that they thought were wrong, like political corruption, economic corruption. These progressives had a very strong moral code that they believed in. Bringing down political machines throughout cities, people like Boss Tweed, whom we've referred to in previous lectures. We want to see some economic regulations. Try to regulate the economy to try to close the gap between people that are immensely wealthy and people who are starving. So you're going to see economic regulations to govern how businesses operate and social and society takes care of itself. These progressives believe that laws and institutions of the United States were not made for an industrial society, and so they needed to bring about some change so that we can work more efficiently. That's what they're all about, efficiency and progress. Education. They want to see some educational reforms. They put a very high value on being educated because these people are educated. Education and awareness actually makes them different. They believe that educating people could not solve all of society's problems, but definitely make some of the problems better. Education leads to opportunity. Education leads to opportunity. So they wanted to use education as a tool of social reform. And then you also see that they want to reform social services and just government services in general. What are some government services? You guys know any government services? How'd you guys get here? In a car? You drive on a dirt path? You drive on a road? Who built that road? People that worked for who? The government with tax money. Okay? So you're going to see a push to increase and improve American infrastructure. Bridges, roads, canals, infrastructure. Those are government services. What would be government social services? Food stamps, welfare, employment agencies, things to help lower class people who are down on their luck not starve. Okay? So this is a massive change in how government performed before the industrial era. Can you imagine Thomas Jefferson saying we need all these things? Big government? Like he's like, hey, government should do as little as possible in the involvement in people's lives. Thomas Jefferson would roll over if he knew of all the services and infrastructure. Because he was very much, government should not be involved in people's lives. But these progressives, they completely changed that and say, we got a lot of problems. We got people starving. We have uneducated people. We have the entire South is very few schools there, and there's a lot of poverty. And so the way in which we can help that is by, hey government, we're going to build some schools. We're going to require people to start going to school. We're going to give people an opportunity that are struggling, and that's kind of the narrative the progressives create. Okay, so questions on that? Okay, now, so that's domestically. What's going on in America? Like this is some of the ideas that are being created at home. Right? When it comes to how we're dealing with foreign nations, we're kind of looking inward and not looking outward. And that is called isolationism. Isolationism. Isolationism was something born out of George Washington in 1796. The United States is protected by oceans on both sides. We have very weak neighbors to the north and south. Canada, Mexico, very weak neighbors. So we could be isolationists. But in the 1890s, is it really a big hardship to cross the ocean? It's becoming less and less of a hardship with the steam engine, and these cruise liners are crossing it, hundreds of them a day. And so isolationism becomes a falsehood. It no longer is able to work because it would be expensive, but could you transport an army of 1 million people across the ocean? You could, and you could do it in a day. Not like start to finish, but you could have 1 million people arrive on the same day. So isolationism becomes a thing of the past. Another reason why is because Americans, we're producing a lot of stuff. And we don't just sell it to ourselves. We want to sell it to everybody in the world, anybody that wants to buy it. So American commercialism would not allow us to be isolationist. Yet our government still wants to be isolationist in the 1890s. So there's going to be some changes there as well, because the United States was a major part of the global economy. And this is a global economy that emerged during the Industrial Revolution and exists to this day. If one nation on the earth that is a part of the global economy has a major tragedy or suffers in some way, it affects everyone else. We are all interconnected on a global sphere. We're all connected to our economies. So the United States is and was a major part of that. So we had active overseas trade with Europe and East Asia and Africa. We were by no means isolated. By no means isolated. But culturally, very isolated. Hey, if you're not white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant, you're not welcome here. Remember that Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882? It wasn't that long ago. Militarily, we're very isolated. We had one of the smallest militaries on Earth in the 1880s and 90s. Politically, very isolated. I'm pretty sure we didn't even send ambassadors to many of the largest foreign nations. We did just completely isolated politically. But commercially, when it came to trade and selling our stuff, our steel, our coal, our timber, very much globally connected. So, the 1890s brings out a rejection of isolationism. And these progressives, who are educated, many of them traveled throughout the world, they want to change from isolationism to internationalism. And with new technology, internationalism became much easier. Think of it today. Let's say that you have a friend, and your friend lives in Australia, and you want to communicate with your friend. How hard is that to do today? How long, if you want to say hello, how long does it take for your message to get to your friend? Like the speed of light. As soon as you press send, it travels at the speed of light to your friend. However fast, 186,000 miles a second. And your friend in Australia sees your message. Oh, hello. That's awesome because of technology. What about if you wanted to say hello to your friend in 1840 in Australia? What would you have to do? Write a letter. Put it on, mail it, put it on a boat, cross the Pacific Ocean, and then once it gets to Australia, how long is it going to take? It could take a year to say hello. It could, okay? We're talking very much, a long time. New inventions and new technology make the world smaller. It's almost as though your neighbor, or almost as though your friend in Australia is your next door neighbor, because you can speak to them just as fast. Now, is the world geographically smaller? Of course not. But technology has made it to where it acts like it's smaller. All right? Inventions like, what is this invention? The telephone. What is this one? The telegraph. Make it possible to keep in touch. The widespread usage of steam power and steel-hulled ships makes it possible to travel and cross the open seas. And in addition to that, it makes it impossible to keep people out because it's so much easier to travel to America. You could get to America in less than a week. And eventually, in this time period, we create air travel. You can fly. Now, this was invented before the airplane. You guys know what this is? The first blimps had a weird word. They were called Zeppelins. But it's a blimp. It's a Zeppelin. Very dangerous. Because they had to fill them with a gas that was lighter than air. And they used, I think, hydrogen. Like hydrogen. What's a property of hydrogen? It's very flammable. You ever heard of the H-bomb? You know what the H in the H-bomb stands for? Hydrogen. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that these are floating nuclear weapons, but they were very flammable. You ever heard of the Hindenburg? It caught on fire in air and crashed in a fiery display into the ground. Now, I think they use helium. I don't think helium's, it just makes your voice squeaky, right? I don't think helium's flammable. All right, but air travel. So geographic isolation, the fact that we're surrounded by ocean on either side, becomes meaningless because of communication and transportation. So We have the realization that communication, transportation, and commerce now make it impossible for us to be isolationists. But this is a way in which we have done things since George Washington, since 1796, since he became president of the United States. America has been isolationist, all right? But we are now being forced into it. And so therefore the 20th century is going to see an era of great change in American history, going from, oh, let's just keep us out, buy our stuff every once in a while, but leave us alone, to we are the most powerful, we are the most wealthy, and now you have to listen to us because we have the most influence. There is a major shift that occurs. You don't go from being like the 12th most powerful nation in the world to the first most powerful nation in the world by a lot in just a period of 20 years without some pretty radical changes. And so the 20th century is a pretty interesting period of time because it's just jam-packed full of stuff. There'll be 30 things happen on a single day in history in the 20th century. So the real death of isolationism, as I mentioned, new technology, communication, transportation, commerce, international investment is a second reason. By my little bank globe here with the money, I thought that was the best picture I could come up with for international investment. What is international investment? Well, by the 1890s, a large part of America, we had a decent amount of infrastructure. We had railroads, and we had bridges and canals and stuff like that. But if we wanted to sell things to our neighbors in, say, South America, Latin America, they don't have the bridges, the roads, the canals. They don't have those things. So, as a businessman, it would be to my interest, I could sell my stuff to more people if there were infrastructure there, because then the stuff could move around easier. Make sense? So you'll see a lot of investment in other nations. People spending money to invest in building things to improve the infrastructure in foreign countries, so that will improve our own business. Do you see how this follows logically? So, for example, Colombia. There's a lot of people in Colombia, a lot of people in Latin and South America. We want to be able to sell stuff to them. Well, if it's in the midst of the Amazon rainforest, kind of tough to get through there. So we're going to invest money, cut some roads, cut some trees down, build some roads so that we can reach the cities and towns of Colombia, so that we can sell our stuff to it. This happened in almost every nation throughout South and Central America during this time, because we wanted to sell stuff to make money. Okay, so foreign investment, international investment, people invested in the markets in other parts of the world, build railroads, and take their own resources. So we began to use the government as a tool of protection for those investments. And that becomes very interesting as, hey, like if I'm a super wealthy person, if I'm a JP Morgan or somebody, and I've got $1 billion invested in Colombia, and all of a sudden a civil war breaks out in Colombia, and the president of Colombia, who's very friendly to me, is under attack, and he's about to be overthrown by a bunch of rebels, might I go to the president of the United States and be like, look, man, I got $1 billion invested down there, and it's about to just disappear. Think you could send the army down there and help me out? Do you think that this occurs? It becomes a very common theme throughout American history in the 20th century of American involvement in Central and South America to protect business investment using the military. Not very isolationist, is it? Not at all. All right, and we'll look at lots of examples of that. Okay? Another thing that brings about the end of isolationism is American public becomes aware of the world. And that's a function of several things. Obviously, we mentioned investment. We've already mentioned increasing education. But a third one, mass media. The mass media phenomenon hits the United States in this era, 1890s, 1900s, and continues to this very day, where we have 10 channels that provide 24-hour-a-day news that you can choose from. You want to know what's going on in the world? Pick up your phone, you can find out in 3 seconds. We are mass consumers of mass media. So, newspaper, now at this time they didn't have Twitter and Snapchat and whatever, CNN, but they had newspapers, many printed several editions a day, and they had dime novels. You know what a dime novel is? D-I-M-E, dime? I bet you can guess. It's a book, it's literature that you pay a dime for, and they're small, cheap books. But they usually have a message or a moral, okay? So the mass media revolution is really entirely based on newspapers. Because newspapers are the most interesting because they're the most up to date. Also, because of an increase in education, what does that lead to an increase of? More reading. What good to you is a newspaper if you cannot read? Well, I guess you could line your clothes with it or use it to, do something with. But as far as reading it, no. So more education means more people who can read, which means more people who can buy newspapers. So owning a newspaper company became very lucrative because more people were purchasing it. It's supply and demand. People wanted it, you can provide it. So, dime novels were more for entertainment purposes, but newspapers looked, a lot like, not like the newspapers today. Newspapers then were more like tabloids because they're competing with one another for readers. I don't know about you, but I can only read one newspaper at a time. And if I go up to the newspaper stand and I have 5 newspapers to choose from, which one do you think I'm going to pick? I'm going to pick the one that has the most interesting headline or the one that appeals to me the most. If all 5 of them have boring headlines, I may not even pick up the paper that day. So it becomes, these newspaper companies become motivated to print the most sensational stories and create the most interesting headlines. What if it's a boring day or a slow news day? You just make it up. And there's a term for that. It's called yellow journalism. And the purpose of creating these headlines serves one purpose, and that's it. What is the purpose of making these headlines? To sell newspapers, to make money. So this strange journalism sold newspapers. And you've seen it at the supermarket. Donald Trump's wife gives birth to 3-headed alien baby. You seen stuff like that? Total and complete nonsense. Just lies, basically, just lies. So, but people like it. People like the drama. People like the controversy. Wars, conflict, drama, scandal, intrigue. These things sell newspapers. Reporters in the 1890s knew that. And American newspapers began to seek out conflict, not just in America, but in the world. Hey, I hear somebody's not getting along. I'm going to go there, and I'm going to check it out. And if I find something, I'll telegraph it back to you, and you can print it in the newspaper today. So you could literally be anywhere in the world, and I could go to China and cover a war and telegraph the war back to my home base in New York, and the stuff that's going on in China today can be found out and printed and known by Americans all on the same day. That was new. So American newspapers began to cover conflict, and there was a big market for those stories. People liked war. Americans in general like war, typically were usually pretty good at it. Up to that point, we'd only lost one, and it was a tie. Okay, so technology of the mass media market was improved. There was also improvements in the actual printing of newspapers with rotating presses, and the making of newspapers became very cheap. It became super cheap. You could get a newspaper for a dime or a nickel in cities. Okay. So that being said, if war is interesting, who do you think would have the most interesting war that would sell the most newspapers? Us! And newspapers knew that. And so they literally make a war. Who makes a war? The government? The government? The newspapers. I don't know about you guys, but I don't think the Register Herald needs to be starting any wars. But that's kind of what happens. And the war that is created out of yellow journalism is the Spanish-American War. So Americans become intensely aware of the dramatic changes going on. And most people realize that we cannot afford to be isolated from the rest of the world. And the catalyst that really shows American influence and the American need to be on the global front. You know how we had manifest destiny? It was believed that it is God's divine right that we should be a coast-to-coast nation. Many people believe there's a new manifest destiny, that it's it's destiny that we will be the most powerful nation in the world, which we were not in the 1890s. But eventually we do become. And the catalyst for this, that it proves it to many Americans, is the Spanish-American War. This is the most lopsided war in American history. And we went to war with Mexico. Remember how that went? How'd that go for Mexico? Not well. We conquered them all the way down to their capital city and took 1/3 of their nation with relative ease. This was more lopsided than that. Okay? So basically, it's a war between America and Spain. So tell me what you know historically about Spain.
They conquered a lot of stuff.
Man, were they ever powerful?
Yeah.
My goodness. Once upon a time, they were the most powerful empire on the planet. Christopher Columbus, Ferdinand Isabella, Hernan Cortez, Francisco Pizarro. Remember those conquistadors whose job it was to go conquer places and then take whatever gold they could back. By the 1890s, Spain, not the same. A very decayed empire. They were in a vast amount of decay. Very weak global power. But did they still have a presence in the New World? Did they still have territory as part of their empire in the New World? Yes. One place in particular where Spain still had a significant amount of ownership was the Caribbean island of Cuba. Ever heard of it? Okay. What is Cuba's geographic relationship to the United States? Very close. In fact, it's only 90 miles of ocean separates Florida from Cuba. All right, so there's only 90 miles. It is geographically very close. Now, as I've told you, Americans have invested a great amount of money in a lot of foreign countries. Cuba is one of those. Even though it's not a country, it's a territory of Spain. But American investors own 90% of all the sugarcane grown in Cuba. People, companies like Domino. Ever heard of it? Yeah, okay. So 90% of all the sugarcane in Cuba was actually owned by Americans, even though the island itself was under Spanish control. We had control of the resources. So right there is instantly a recipe for trouble. Okay? So because Cuba was owned by Spain. And in order to win a revolution against Spain for Cubans, they would need the United States help. So the Cuban people, these former slaves who were brought to Cuba to work in the sugar fields, they don't really want to be part of Spain anymore. They don't want to be part of Spain anymore. And in order for them to win a revolution to overthrow Spanish authority, they would need the United States to get involved. How do they get the United States involved? Because the United States, do we really have any business butting in another country? Not really. I mean, we don't. Okay? It'd be like the Japanese being like, we sell more Toyotas to American than anywhere else. So, California, you have a lot of Toyotas, so we're going to take California. Does that make any sense at all? No, but it would be very similar. Okay? I'm sure Toyota sells probably the majority of their cars to Americans as opposed to any other nation. So they had to make it look like Spain was threatening Cuban sugarcane. Like Spain was threatening Cuban and American interests there. And the newspapers had to make it appear like it was the democratic thing to do, because that could get the American public behind it. So that is where we will pick up tomorrow.